Sarah Martinez had always been different from other women in her small hometown of Millbrook. While her childhood friends dreamed of wedding dresses and white picket fences, Sarah dreamed of serving her country. At 18, when most of her classmates were heading to college or starting families, Sarah walked into the Army recruitment office with determination burning in her eyes. The recruiter, Staff Sergeant Williams, looked up from his paperwork with barely concealed skepticism. In 1985, women in the military were still fighting for respect and recognition. Combat roles were closed to them, and many believed that women simply didn't belong in uniform. But Sarah wasn't deterred by the raised eyebrows or the condescending questions about whether she was sure she could handle the physical demands. "I want to serve," she told the recruiter simply. "I want to make a difference." 23 years later, Sarah sat in the back corner of the Millbrook Community Center, watching as her high school reunion buzzed with activity around her. The decorations were predictably nostalgic: photos from their graduation, banners in school colors, and tables laden with food that reminded everyone of their youth. But Sarah felt like an outsider looking in. She wore a simple black dress, nothing fancy or attention-grabbing. Her graying hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried herself with the straight-backed posture that years of military service had ingrained in her. On her jacket lapel, she wore a small collection of military medals and ribbons, evidence of her decades of service that had taken her to places most of her classmates had only seen on the news. The reunion committee had sent her an invitation months ago, and Sarah had debated whether to attend. After retiring from the Army the previous year, she had returned to Millbrook to care for her aging mother. The transition from military life to civilian life had been harder than she expected. In the Army, her rank and experience commanded automatic respect. Here, she was just another middle-aged woman that people vaguely remembered from high school. As Sarah nursed her punch and watched her former classmates reconnect, she couldn't help but notice the curious glances directed her way. Some people recognized her, but many didn't. The girl they remembered had been quiet and serious, always talking about joining the military while everyone else focused on more traditional paths for women. "Sarah Martinez? Is that really you?" The voice belonged to Jennifer Walsh, who had been the homecoming queen senior year. Jennifer approached with a bright smile, her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer dress making Sarah acutely aware of how different their lives had been. "Hello, Jennifer," Sarah replied politely, standing to greet her former classmate. "Oh my goodness, I heard you joined the Army right after graduation. Are you still doing that?" Jennifer's tone was friendly but carried an undertone that suggested military service was something one did temporarily, like a gap year before real life began. "I retired last year after 23 years of service," Sarah answered simply. Jennifer's eyes widened slightly as she processed this information. 23 years? Wow, that's a long time. What did you do exactly? Sarah had learned over the years that civilians often had limited understanding of military roles, especially for women. "I started in military intelligence, then moved into logistics and operations planning. I served multiple deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, managed supply chains for forward operating bases, and supervised intelligence gathering operations." The explanation seemed to go over Jennifer's head. "That sounds complicated. Did you ever get married? Have kids?" It was a question Sarah had grown tired of answering. The assumption was always that military service was something that prevented a normal life, rather than being a valid life choice in itself. "No, I never married. My career kept me pretty busy." "Oh, that's too bad," Jennifer said with what she probably thought was sympathy. "Well, I'm sure you'll find someone now that you're back home. It's never too late to settle down and start a family." Before Sarah could respond, Jennifer's attention was caught by someone else across the room. "Oh, there's Michelle. I have to go say hi. It was so good seeing you, Sarah. Maybe we can catch up more later." And, with that, she hurried away, leaving Sarah standing alone again. Similar conversations followed throughout the evening. People approached with curiosity about her military service, but their questions revealed assumptions that made Sarah uncomfortable. They seemed to view her career as either a temporary adventure or a sacrifice that had cost her a real life. Tom Bradley, who had been the star quarterback, struck up a conversation about patriotism and thanked her for her service, but then immediately launched into stories about his successful construction business and how he'd built it from the ground up. The implication was clear: while Sarah had been playing soldier, he had been building something real and substantial. "You know," Tom said, gesturing with his beer, "it's great that you served and all, but now you can focus on what really matters. Maybe start a family, find a nice guy to settle down with. My wife's got a cousin who's recently divorced, good guy, steady job. I could introduce you." Sarah forced a smile. "That's kind of you, but I'm doing fine on my own." "Come on, Sarah. No woman wants to be alone forever. You've done your duty to the country. Now it's time to focus on being a woman." The comment stung, though Sarah kept her expression neutral. She had heard variations of it throughout her career, the suggestion that military service somehow made her less feminine or that she had been postponing her real life as a woman in favor of playing it being a soldier. As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself gravitating toward the display table that the reunion committee had set up. It featured photos and memorabilia from their graduating class, including updates on what everyone had been doing since high school. She noticed that the few military veterans from their class were barely mentioned, while significant space was devoted to business successes, political appointments, and family achievements. Margaret Foster, who had been class president and was now a successful real estate agent, joined Sarah at the display table. "It's amazing to see how everyone turned out, isn't it?" she said, surveying the photos and updates. "I mean, look at all these success stories: Jim's law practice, Patricia's restaurant chain, Mike's car dealership empire." Sarah nodded politely, noting that none of her own achievements were mentioned in the display. "I heard you were in the army," Margaret continued. "That must have been interesting. I can't imagine living that kind of life, all that moving around, taking orders, never really being able to put down roots or build something lasting." "It had its rewards," Sarah said carefully. "I'm sure it did. And thank you for your service, of course. It's just that I always believed in building something right here at home, you know? Contributing to the community, raising the next generation, creating jobs for local people. That's the kind of service that really makes a difference in people's daily lives." The dismissive tone was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah had spent over 2 decades protecting the freedoms that allowed people like Margaret to build their businesses and raise their families in safety, but somehow her service was being characterized as less meaningful than selling houses. As the evening progressed, Sarah began to notice a pattern in the conversations. People were polite and thanked her for her service, but there was an underlying assumption that military service was something you did when you couldn't succeed in the real world. Several classmates made comments about how nice it was that she could now come home and start living a normal life. The breaking point came when she overheard a conversation between 3 of her female classmates near the refreshment table. They were discussing the various achievements of their graduating class, and Sarah's name came up. "Remember Sarah Martinez? She's here tonight," said Lisa Chen, who had become a pediatric nurse. "Oh yes, I saw her earlier. She was in the army for like 20 years or something," replied Amanda Stevens, now a mother of 3 and successful marketing consultant. "That's so sad," chimed in the third woman, whose name Sarah couldn't remember but who had apparently become a teacher. "I mean, all these years and she has nothing to show for it. No husband, no kids, no real career she can point to. Just a bunch of medals that don't really mean anything in the real world." "I know, right?" Amanda agreed. "Like, what do you do with military experience when you get out? It's not like she learned any real skills that translate to civilian life. She's basically starting over at 50. And, look at her," Lisa added, glancing in Sarah's direction. She doesn't even know how to dress for a social event. That outfit looks like she's going to a funeral. Military life really doesn't prepare women for rejoining normal society. Sarah felt her face flush with anger and hurt, but she maintained her composure. These women had no idea what she had accomplished, what she had sacrificed, or what her service had meant to the hundreds of soldiers under her command and the thousands of lives that had been protected by her work. But their words reflected a broader societal attitude that diminished military service, especially service by women. The irony wasn't lost on her. While these women had been building their comfortable lives in their safe hometown, Sarah had been ensuring that such safety was possible. She had managed multi-million-dollar operations, led teams of specialists, made life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure, and coordinated complex missions that kept American forces and civilians safe. But, because her achievements couldn't be measured in sales figures or family photos, they were dismissed as meaningless. As the reunion began winding down, Sarah made her way toward the exit. She had fulfilled her social obligation by attending, but she saw no point in staying longer. The evening had reinforced her sense of being caught between two worlds, no longer fully part of the military community that had been her life for over 2 decades, but not really fitting into the civilian world that her classmates inhabited. Near the door, she encountered David Park, another classmate who had taken a different path. David had become a social worker and seemed more genuinely interested in her experiences than most of the others. "Sarah, I wanted to catch you before you left," he said. "I've been thinking all evening about the different ways people serve their communities and their country. What you did, dedicating your whole adult life to military service, that takes a special kind of commitment and sacrifice." His words were the first recognition of the night that felt genuine rather than perfunctory. "Thank you, David. That means a lot. I work with veterans sometimes in my job, and I see how hard the transition can be. People don't always understand what military service involves or what veterans bring to civilian careers. But your experience managing complex operations and leading people under pressure, those are incredibly valuable skills." Sarah nodded, appreciating that someone finally understood that her military service had been about more than just following orders or playing soldier. As Sarah drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, she reflected on the evening. The reunion had crystallized something she had been feeling since returning home, a sense that her decades of service and sacrifice were not valued or understood by the broader community. The medals on her jacket represented achievements that her classmates couldn't comprehend or appreciate. But Sarah also felt a growing determination. She had spent her career breaking barriers and exceeding expectations in environments where women weren't always welcome. She had proven herself time and again in situations far more challenging than a high school reunion. If her hometown couldn't immediately recognize her worth, perhaps it was time to show them what they had overlooked. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah made a decision. She wouldn't let the dismissive comments and shallow assumptions define her or diminish her sense of self-worth. She had spent 23 years serving her country with honor and distinction, rising through the ranks despite facing discrimination and skepticism at every level. She had commanded respect in some of the most challenging environments imaginable. If her classmates thought her medals were meaningless decorations and her service was a waste of time, perhaps they needed to understand what those medals represented and what kind of person earned them. Sarah Martinez had never backed down from a challenge in her military career, and she wasn't about to start now. The next chapter of her life was just beginning, and she was determined to show everyone, including herself, that a career in service to one's country was not a consolation prize or a stepping stone to something better. It was a calling that demanded the highest levels of skill, courage, and dedication. And those qualities didn't disappear just because someone hung up their uniform. As she unlocked her front door and stepped inside, Sarah felt a familiar sense of resolve settling over her. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to demonstrate her worth and, maybe, just maybe, to educate some people about what military service really meant. The reunion had shown her that she still had battles to fight, but this time they would be fought in the civilian world. And Sarah Martinez had never lost a battle yet. 3 weeks after the reunion, Sarah found herself sitting in the waiting room of Henderson and Associates, one of Millbrook's most prestigious consulting firms. The mahogany furniture and expensive artwork on the walls spoke of success and influence, exactly the kind of civilian achievement that her former classmates respected and understood. Sarah had spent the days following the reunion researching opportunities to translate her military experience into civilian success. She wasn't driven by a desire for wealth or status, but rather by a determination to prove that military service developed skills that were not only relevant but invaluable in the business world. Henderson and Associates specialized in logistics consulting for major corporations, helping companies optimize their supply chains and improve operational efficiency. When Sarah learned about an opening for a senior consultant position, she realized it was perfect. Her military background in logistics and operations planning was directly applicable, and the firm worked with Fortune 500 companies, the kind of high-profile clients that would make people take notice. Ms. Martinez? A young receptionist with perfectly styled hair and a designer suit called her name. Mr. Henderson will see you now. Sarah followed the receptionist down a hallway lined with awards and photographs of the company's leadership team meeting with politicians and business leaders. She had dressed carefully for the interview, choosing a conservative navy suit that projected professionalism while wearing her military decorations on the lapel, a subtle reminder of her background and achievements. Richard Henderson's office was impressive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Millbrook and walls covered with diplomas, awards, and photos of Henderson with various dignitaries. Henderson himself was in his early 60s, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone who had built a successful business from nothing. "Please, have a seat," Henderson said, gesturing to a chair across from his massive desk. "I have to say, your resume is quite interesting. 23 years in the Army, that's quite a commitment." "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me," Sarah replied. "I believe my experience in military logistics and operations management would be valuable in helping your clients optimize their supply chains and improve efficiency." Henderson leaned back in his chair, studying her with the appraising look of someone trying to determine her value. "Tell me about your military experience. What exactly did you do?" Sarah launched into a detailed explanation of her career progression, from her early days in military intelligence to her later roles managing complex logistics operations. She described coordinating supply chains for forward operating bases in hostile environments, managing multi-million-dollar budgets, and supervising teams of specialists under extreme pressure. "I was responsible for ensuring that thousands of soldiers had everything they needed: food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, equipment, delivered to remote locations under dangerous conditions," she explained. "Any failure in the system could mean the difference between life and death for American forces." Henderson nodded politely, but Sarah could sense his skepticism. "That's certainly impressive from a patriotic standpoint," he said finally. "But our clients are Fortune 500 companies dealing with complex global markets, demanding shareholders, and intense competition. Military logistics is important, but it's quite different from the business world." The comment echoed the dismissive attitude Sarah had encountered at the reunion. There seemed to be an assumption that military operations were somehow simpler or less sophisticated than business operations. "Actually, I think you might be surprised by the similarities," Sarah responded calmly. "In both environments, you're managing complex supply chains with multiple vendors, coordinating transportation across vast distances, dealing with budget constraints, and adapting to rapidly changing conditions. The main difference is that in the military, the consequences of failure are measured in lives lost rather than profits declined." "That's an interesting perspective," Henderson acknowledged, though his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. "But business requires a different set of skills. You need to understand profit margins, market dynamics, customer relationships, competitive positioning. These are concepts that don't really apply in a military context where funding is guaranteed and you don't have to worry about losing clients to competitors." Sarah felt her patience beginning to wear thin, but she maintained her professional composure. With respect, Mr. Henderson, that's not entirely accurate. Military units compete for funding just like businesses compete for customers. We had to justify our budgets, demonstrate our value, and prove our effectiveness to secure resources. And, in today's military, we work extensively with private contractors and vendors, which requires understanding market dynamics and managing complex business relationships. Henderson's expression shifted slightly, suggesting she had made an interesting point. I suppose that's true. But, what about leadership experience? In the business world, you need to motivate employees through incentives and performance management, not through rank and military discipline. How do you inspire performance when you can't simply give orders and expect them to be followed? This question revealed another common misconception about military leadership. Sarah had encountered it throughout her career from civilians who believed that military leadership was simply about giving orders and expecting blind obedience. Actually, effective military leadership requires exactly the same skills as business leadership, Sarah explained. You have to earn respect through competence and character, not just rely on rank. You need to motivate people who are often facing difficult and dangerous situations, manage diverse personalities and backgrounds, and build cohesive teams. And, unlike in business, military leaders are responsible for developing their subordinates and helping them advance their careers, even when that means losing your best people to promotions. Interesting, Henderson mused. Can you give me a specific example of a complex project you managed? Sarah thought for a moment, then described a particularly challenging deployment where she had been responsible for establishing supply lines to a new forward operating base in Afghanistan. We had to coordinate with multiple military units, international allies, local contractors, and civilian agencies. The project involved transporting millions of dollars worth of equipment and supplies across 500 miles of hostile territory using various transportation methods, convoys, helicopters, and airdrops. She went on to detail the complexity of the operation, managing security concerns, working around weather delays, coordinating with local tribal leaders, negotiating with contractors who spoke different languages and operated under different cultural norms, and adapting the plan when intelligence reports indicated changes in the threat environment. The project had to be completed within a 6-week window, and failure wasn't an option because troops were depending on those supplies to establish defensive positions and begin operations, she concluded. We delivered everything on schedule and under budget while maintaining a zero casualty rate. Henderson seemed genuinely impressed by the scope and complexity of the operation. That does sound like it required sophisticated project management skills. What was your budget for that project? Approximately $12 million, not including the cost of security and transportation assets provided by other units. $12 million? Henderson's eyebrows rose. How many people were you supervising? About 40 direct reports, but the operation involved coordination with over 200 personnel across multiple organizations. For the first time in the interview, Henderson looked like he was reconsidering his initial assumptions. Managing a $12 million project with coordination across multiple organizations was exactly the kind of experience his firm valued in senior consultants. What kind of metrics did you use to measure success? Sarah smiled slightly. This was familiar territory. We tracked on-time delivery rates, cost variance from budget, security incident rates, equipment readiness levels, and mission completion percentages. Everything was documented and analyzed to identify areas for improvement in future operations. That's very thorough, Henderson admitted. How did you handle situations where things went wrong? Constantly, Sarah replied with a slight laugh. No plan survives contact with reality, whether in military operations or business projects. The key is building flexibility into your systems, having contingency plans, and maintaining clear communication channels so you can adapt quickly when circumstances change. She described a situation where a key supply convoy had been delayed by 3 days due to weather and security concerns, threatening to derail the entire operation. Rather than simply waiting for the convoy, she had worked with air transportation assets to deliver critical supplies via helicopter while simultaneously negotiating with local contractors to provide temporary alternatives for less critical items. The result was that we maintained our overall timeline while actually reducing costs by optimizing the transportation mix, she explained. But it required quick decision-making, creative problem-solving, and the ability to coordinate with multiple stakeholders under pressure. Henderson was taking notes now, which Sarah took as a positive sign. What would you say was your greatest leadership challenge? Sarah considered the question carefully. She had faced many difficult leadership situations, but one in particular stood out because it involved exactly the kind of complex stakeholder management that was crucial in business consulting. I was leading a joint operation with British and Canadian forces, plus several civilian contractor organizations, she began. Each group had different procedures, priorities, and communication protocols. The British were focused on operational security, the Canadians were concerned about environmental impact, and the contractors were worried about cost overruns and schedule delays. She described how she had spent the first week of the deployment just understanding each group's concerns and constraints, then developing a modified operational plan that addressed everyone's priorities while still achieving the mission objectives. The key was recognizing that each stakeholder had legitimate concerns based on their organizational culture and responsibilities, she explained. Rather than trying to impose a one-size-fits-all solution, I worked with each group to develop procedures that met their needs while contributing to our shared objectives. How did you measure the success of that approach? The operation was completed ahead of schedule and under budget, with zero safety incidents and minimal environmental impact. More importantly, the relationships we built during that deployment led to improved cooperation in future joint operations. Several of the contractor representatives specifically requested to work with our unit on subsequent projects. Henderson set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. Ms. Martinez, I have to admit that when I saw your resume, I wasn't sure how military experience would translate to business consulting. But the projects you've described demonstrate exactly the kind of complex stakeholder management and operational expertise our clients need. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction but kept her expression professional. I appreciate that, Mr. Henderson. I think many people don't realize how sophisticated modern military operations are, or how directly those skills apply to business challenges. Indeed. Now, let me ask you about something else. Our consultants often work with senior executives who can be challenging. They're used to being the smartest person in the room and don't always appreciate outside advice, even when they're paying for it. How would you handle a situation where a client executive was dismissive of your recommendations? Sarah smiled slightly. This was a situation she had faced many times in the military when dealing with senior officers who questioned her expertise or authority. In my experience, resistance to new ideas usually comes from one of three sources, she replied. Either the person doesn't understand the problem clearly, they don't trust the proposed solution, or they're concerned about how the change will affect their own position or responsibilities. She described a situation where she had been brought in to improve supply chain efficiency for a unit whose commanding officer was convinced that his current systems were adequate. Rather than challenging him directly, she had spent time understanding his concerns and learning about the historical context that had shaped his current approach. It turned out that he had implemented the current system after some previous improvements had created serious problems, she explained. Once I understood his perspective, I was able to modify my recommendations to address his concerns while still achieving the efficiency improvements. The key was demonstrating that I respected his experience and wasn't trying to impose solutions without understanding the full context. How did that turn out? The modified approach achieved even better results than my original plan because it incorporated his knowledge of potential pitfalls I hadn't initially considered. And he became one of my strongest advocates because he felt heard and respected rather than dismissed. Henderson nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of approach our clients need. Many consultants come in with preconceived solutions and wonder why they face resistance. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, with Henderson asking detailed questions about Sarah's experience with budget management, performance measurement, change management, and crisis response. With each question, Sarah could see his initial skepticism giving way to genuine interest and respect. Finally, Henderson stood up and extended his hand. "Ms. Martinez, this has been one of the most interesting interviews I've conducted in years. Your military experience has clearly provided you with exactly the kind of sophisticated operational and leadership skills our clients need. I'd like to offer you the senior consultant position." Sarah felt a wave of vindication, but she maintained her professional composure. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. I'm very interested in the opportunity. When would you like me to start? How about next Monday?" "I have a client meeting next week with Morrison Industries. They're a manufacturing company struggling with supply chain inefficiencies. I think your background would be perfect for helping them solve their problems." As Sarah left Henderson and Associates that afternoon, she felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond simply landing a new job. She had proven, at least to one successful businessman, that military experience wasn't a stepping stone to real achievement, it was real achievement that translated directly to civilian success. But she also knew that Henderson's initial skepticism reflected broader societal attitudes that would take more than one successful interview to change. The real test would come when she started working with clients and colleagues who might share the dismissive views she had encountered at her reunion. Over the weekend, Sarah prepared for her new role by researching Morrison Industries and developing preliminary ideas for addressing their supply chain challenges. She also spent time reflecting on the interview and what it had taught her about the civilian perception of military service. The most frustrating part was realizing how much talent and experience was being wasted because of misconceptions about military service. How many other veterans were being overlooked for opportunities they were perfectly qualified for because civilians didn't understand what military service actually involved? Sarah made a mental note to address this issue somehow in her new role. If she could demonstrate the value of military experience through her own success, perhaps she could help other veterans make similar transitions and help businesses recognize the untapped potential in the veteran community. As she prepared for her first day at Henderson and Associates, Sarah felt a familiar sense of excitement and determination. She was embarking on a new mission, and, like every mission she had undertaken in her military career, she was committed to achieving success while exceeding everyone's expectations. The corporate world was about to discover what military excellence looked like in a business suit, and Sarah Martinez was ready to show them. Sarah's first 6 months at Henderson and Associates exceeded everyone's expectations, including her own. The Morrison Industries project had been a resounding success, with her recommendations resulting in a 23% improvement in supply chain efficiency and cost savings of over $2 million annually. Word of her success spread quickly through Millbrook's business community, and she found herself in demand as other companies sought her expertise. But success in the corporate world didn't automatically translate to social acceptance, as Sarah discovered when she was invited to join the Millbrook Business Leaders Association. The monthly meetings were held at the exclusive Millbrook Country Club, and membership was considered a mark of achievement and social status in the community. As Sarah drove through the country club's gates for her first meeting, she couldn't help but notice the contrast with the environments where she had spent most of her adult life. The manicured golf course and elegant clubhouse represented a world of privilege and comfort that felt foreign after decades of military bases and operational environments. The meeting was already in progress when Sarah arrived. About 30 business leaders, mostly men in expensive suits, sat around tables in the club's private dining room. She recognized several faces from her high school reunion, including Tom Bradley and Margaret Foster, who looked surprised to see her there. "Sarah Martinez, everyone," announced Richard Henderson as she found a seat at his table. "Sarah is our newest senior consultant and has been instrumental in helping several local companies optimize their operations." The polite applause that followed felt perfunctory, and Sarah sensed the subtle skepticism in the room. She was clearly an outsider in this world of established business relationships and old boy networks. The meeting focused on a proposal to bring a major manufacturing plant to Millbrook, which would create hundreds of jobs and significantly boost the local economy. Various members offered their perspectives on how to make Millbrook attractive to the company, discussing tax incentives, infrastructure improvements, and workforce development. The key is demonstrating that we have the business sophistication they're looking for, argued James Peterson, who owned the largest bank in town. These Fortune 500 companies want to work with communities that understand modern business practices and can provide the kind of support they need. Absolutely, agreed Margaret Foster. We need to show them that Millbrook isn't some small town that doesn't understand how business works. We have real expertise here, people who have built successful companies from the ground up. Sarah listened quietly, taking notes and analyzing the various proposals being discussed. As someone who had managed complex operations in challenging environments, she could see several potential problems with their approach that weren't being addressed. When the discussion turned to logistics and supply chain considerations, Henderson turned to Sarah. What's your perspective on this? You've worked with several manufacturing companies on similar issues. All eyes turned to Sarah as she stood to address the group. She could sense the skepticism in the room. Many of these people had known her as the quiet girl who had chosen military service over building a real career. Thank you, Mr. Henderson, she began, her voice steady and confident. I think the proposal has a lot of merit, but I'd like to suggest some additional considerations that might strengthen our position. She walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room and began outlining her analysis. Based on the company's current operations and supply chain requirements, they're going to need access to specific transportation corridors and distribution networks. Our current infrastructure proposal doesn't fully address their need for multimodal transportation options. Sarah drew a diagram showing how the proposed plant would fit into the company's existing supply chain network, identifying potential bottlenecks and inefficiencies that could make Millbrook less attractive than competing locations. If we modify our infrastructure proposal to include improved rail connections and optimize the highway access points, we could position Millbrook as not just another manufacturing location, but as a strategic hub that improves their entire regional distribution network. She went on to detail specific improvements that would cost relatively little but provide significant value to the target company. Her presentation was crisp, professional, and backed by data and analysis that demonstrated a deep understanding of complex business operations. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then, Peterson spoke up. That's quite insightful. How did you develop that level of expertise in supply chain analysis? Sarah sensed the subtle challenge in his question, the implication that her military background couldn't possibly have prepared her for sophisticated business analysis. Much of it comes from my military experience, she replied calmly. I spent several years managing supply chains for forward operating bases, which required understanding multimodal transportation networks, vendor relationships, and operational optimization under challenging conditions. But that's quite different from civilian business operations, isn't it? Interjected Tom Bradley. I mean, the military doesn't have to worry about profits, competition, or customer satisfaction the way real businesses do. Sarah felt the familiar frustration rising but kept her voice level. Actually, the similarities are striking. Military operations require managing complex vendor relationships, optimizing resource allocation under budget constraints, and delivering results under intense pressure. The main difference is that the consequences of failure are more immediate and severe. That's an interesting perspective, said Margaret Foster in a tone that suggested she found it anything but interesting. But business requires understanding market dynamics, customer relationships, and competitive positioning, concepts that don't really apply in a government-funded environment. The comment revealed the same misconceptions Sarah had encountered repeatedly. She decided it was time to address them directly. Actually, that's not accurate, she replied, maintaining her professional tone despite her growing irritation. Modern military operations involve extensive collaboration with private contractors, international partners, and civilian organizations. We had to compete for resources, demonstrate value to secure funding, and build relationships with stakeholders who had different priorities and objectives. She described a complex operation she had managed that involved coordinating with 12 different organizations, including private contractors, international allies, and civilian agencies, each with their own agendas and constraints. The project succeeded because we understood each stakeholder's business model and incentives, then structured our approach to create value for everyone involved, she explained. That's exactly the kind of stakeholder management that businesses use to build successful partnerships. The room was quiet as people processed this information. Sarah could see that some members were reconsidering their assumptions about military experience, but others remained skeptical. "Well, that's all very interesting," said Peterson finally, "but I think we should focus on practical business considerations rather than theoretical comparisons." It was a dismissive comment designed to shut down the discussion and marginalize Sarah's input. But Henderson wasn't ready to let it go. "Actually, I think Sarah's analysis is exactly the kind of practical business insight we need," he said firmly. Her recommendations for infrastructure improvements could be the difference between winning and losing this opportunity. Over the following weeks, Sarah's infrastructure recommendations were incorporated into the city's proposal, and her analysis proved crucial when the manufacturing company's site selection team visited Millbrook. The team was impressed by the sophisticated understanding of their operational requirements and chose Millbrook over 3 competing locations. The success brought Sarah recognition and grudging respect from the business community, but it also intensified the subtle resistance she faced from some quarters. At the next Business Leaders Association meeting, she found herself seated at a table with several members who seemed determined to put her in her place. "I heard you played a role in landing the Morrison Industries plant," said Charles Whitman, who owned a chain of car dealerships. "That's quite an achievement for someone who's new to the business world." The backhanded compliment was typical of the treatment Sarah had come to expect. Her success was acknowledged but minimized, attributed to luck or beginner's enthusiasm rather than genuine expertise. "Thank you," Sarah replied simply, not taking the bait. "Of course, landing one client doesn't make someone an expert," continued Whitman. "Business is about building long-term relationships and understanding the complexities of market dynamics. That takes years of experience in the real world." "I agree that experience is important," Sarah said calmly. "What specific aspects of market dynamics do you think are most crucial for success in today's environment?" It was a direct challenge, and Whitman seemed taken aback. He launched into a rambling discourse about customer loyalty and competitive positioning that revealed his limited understanding of modern business strategy. As Whitman spoke, Sarah noticed that several other members at the table were listening with barely concealed boredom. His ideas were outdated and superficial, the kind of conventional wisdom that successful companies had moved beyond years ago. When he finished, Sarah nodded politely. "Those are certainly important considerations. In my experience, though, the most successful companies today are those that can adapt quickly to changing conditions and integrate complex stakeholder requirements into their strategic planning." She went on to describe emerging trends in supply chain management and operations optimization that most traditional businesses were struggling to understand, much less implement. Her analysis was sophisticated and forward-thinking, reflecting her exposure to cutting-edge practices through her consulting work. The contrast with Whitman's outdated perspectives was obvious to everyone at the table. Sarah wasn't just competing with local business leaders on their own terms, she was operating at a level that many of them couldn't match. As the meeting continued, Sarah found herself fielding questions from other members who were genuinely interested in her insights. Her military background, rather than being a liability, provided her with a unique perspective on leadership, crisis management, and operational efficiency that was increasingly valuable in today's complex business environment. But not everyone was impressed by her success. During the networking period after the meeting, Sarah overheard a conversation between Margaret Foster and 2 other women that made her blood boil. "I don't understand all the fuss about Sarah Martinez," Margaret was saying. So she got lucky with one project and now everyone thinks she's some kind of business genius. I know, right? Agreed Linda Davis, who owned a boutique marketing firm. It's not like military experience really prepares you for understanding business. She's basically learning on the job while the rest of us have been building real expertise for decades. And, have you seen those medals she wears? Added the third woman, whose name Sarah couldn't remember. It's so inappropriate for business settings. Like she can't let go of her military identity and accept that she's in the real world now. Sarah felt her face flush with anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. The medals on her lapel weren't jewelry or decorations, they were symbols of achievement and sacrifice that these women couldn't begin to understand. As she drove home that evening, Sarah reflected on the progress she had made and the challenges that remained. Her professional success was undeniable. Henderson and Associates was thriving, and her reputation as a consultant was growing throughout the region. But social acceptance remained elusive. The problem wasn't her competence or qualifications. The problem was that her success challenged assumptions about the value of military service and the paths to achievement that the local business community respected. Her presence forced people to confront the possibility that their dismissive attitudes toward military service were wrong. Sarah realized that she was fighting two battles simultaneously. The first was the normal challenge of establishing herself in a new career and community. The second was a deeper battle against prejudices and misconceptions that devalued military service and the people who chose to serve. She thought about the hundreds of veterans she had known during her military career, intelligent, dedicated professionals who had managed complex operations, led diverse teams, and solved problems under extreme pressure. How many of them had faced similar challenges when transitioning to civilian careers? How many had been overlooked or underestimated because of misconceptions about military service? As Sarah pulled into her driveway, she made a decision. She wouldn't be content with just achieving personal success. She would use her position and growing influence to change attitudes about military service and help other veterans receive the recognition and opportunities they deserved. The local business community was about to learn that military excellence wasn't a consolation prize or a stepping stone to something better. It was a standard of performance and commitment that could transform any organization fortunate enough to recognize and embrace it. And Sarah Martinez was just getting started. 1 year after joining Henderson and Associates, Sarah had become one of the most successful consultants in Millbrook. Her client list included major corporations throughout the region, and her innovative approaches to supply chain optimization and operational efficiency had saved companies millions of dollars. Yet despite her professional success, she continued to face subtle resistance and dismissive attitudes from certain segments of the community. The breaking point came during the annual Millbrook Business Achievement Awards dinner, held at the country club's grand ballroom. Sarah had been nominated for the Newcomer Achievement Award, recognizing her rapid impact on the local business community. As she sat at Henderson and Associates' table, dressed in an elegant black gown with her military decorations properly displayed, she felt both pride in her accomplishments and frustration at the condescending attitude she continued to encounter. The evening began pleasantly enough, with cocktails and networking before the dinner and award presentations. Sarah found herself in conversations with several clients who praised her work and expressed genuine appreciation for the results she had achieved for their companies. "Sarah, I wanted to thank you again for the work you did with our distribution network," said Robert Chen, CEO of Pacific Technologies. "The improvements you recommended have increased our efficiency by 30% and reduced our costs by almost $2 million annually." "I'm glad we could help," Sarah replied modestly. "The key was understanding your specific operational requirements and finding creative solutions that addressed multiple challenges simultaneously." "That's exactly what impressed us," Chen continued. "Your military background really showed in how you approached the project: systematic analysis, clear objectives, and flawless execution. We've worked with other consultants who promised similar results but couldn't deliver. As Chen walked away, Sarah noticed Margaret Foster and Linda Davis standing nearby, having overheard the conversation. Their expressions suggested they were less than pleased by the praise Sarah had received. "It's amazing how some people can take credit for obvious solutions," Margaret said loudly enough for Sarah to hear. "I mean, how hard is it to tell a company to improve their efficiency? Any competent business consultant could have made those recommendations." Sarah felt her jaw tighten but decided to ignore the comment. She had learned that direct confrontation with people like Margaret usually backfired, making her appear defensive while allowing them to play the victim. The dinner proceeded with the usual speeches and presentations recognizing various business achievements in the community. Sarah noticed that most of the award recipients were longtime residents who had built traditional businesses, retail stores, construction companies, professional services firms. The emphasis was clearly on homegrown success stories that reflected conventional paths to achievement. When the Newcomer Achievement Award was announced, Sarah felt a mix of anticipation and resignation. She had been told by Henderson that she was the front-runner for the award, but she also knew that her military background made some people uncomfortable with recognizing her success. The Newcomer Achievement Award recognizes an individual who has made a significant impact on our business community despite being relatively new to our area, announced the presenter, City Council member Patricia Williams. This year's nominees have all demonstrated exceptional professional success and community involvement. Williams went through the list of nominees, providing brief biographical sketches that emphasized their business achievements and community contributions. When she reached Sarah's name, her description was notably brief and generic. Sarah Martinez joined Henderson and Associates last year after completing a career in the military. She has worked with several local companies on operational improvements. The description was technically accurate but completely failed to capture the scope and significance of Sarah's achievements. There was no mention of the millions of dollars in cost savings she had generated, the major manufacturing plant she had helped bring to Millbrook, or the innovative approaches that had set new standards for consulting in the region. The winner of this year's Newcomer Achievement Award is David Morrison, for his exceptional work in establishing Morrison Financial Services and his leadership in promoting economic development in our community. Polite applause filled the room as Morrison, a young man who had opened a financial planning firm after leaving his father's established business, stood to accept the award. Sarah applauded politely, though she couldn't help but notice the contrast in how Morrison's achievements were being celebrated compared to how her military service was dismissed. As the evening continued, Sarah found herself increasingly isolated at her table. Henderson was networking with potential clients, and other colleagues were engaged in conversations that seemed to exclude her. She began to wonder if attending had been a mistake. The situation deteriorated further during the networking period after the awards presentation. Sarah was standing near the bar when she overheard a conversation between Charles Whitman, Margaret Foster, and several other business leaders that made her blood boil. "I can't believe they even nominated her for the award," Whitman was saying. "I mean, what has she really accomplished? She follows some checklist she learned in the army and, suddenly, she's a business expert?" "Exactly," Margaret agreed. "And those medals she insists on wearing everywhere, it's so inappropriate. This is a business dinner, not a military ceremony. She needs to accept that she's not a soldier anymore." "The whole thing is ridiculous," added Tom Bradley. "We're supposed to be impressed because she can organize supply chains? My construction crews do more complex logistics every day, and we don't need fancy military training to figure it out. What bothers me most is how she acts like her military experience makes her superior to those of us who built real businesses," said Linda Davis. "Like somehow risking your life overseas is more important than creating jobs and contributing to the community right here at home. And, let's be honest," Whitman continued, lowering his voice slightly, "what kind of woman spends 20 years in the military instead of getting married and starting a family? There's something not quite right about that choice." The personal attack was the final straw. Sarah had endured months of subtle discrimination and dismissive comments about her military service, but questioning her choice to serve her country, and her worth as a woman crossed a line she couldn't ignore. She approached the group with her shoulders squared and her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation about my military service." The group fell silent, clearly embarrassed at being caught gossiping but trying to maintain their composure. Whitman recovered first, putting on a patronizing smile. "Oh, Sarah, we were just discussing the award ceremony. Congratulations on your nomination, quite an honor for someone so new to the business community." "Thank you," Sarah replied evenly. "But I think there might be some misunderstandings about what military service involves and how it relates to business success." "Now, Sarah," Margaret interjected with false sweetness, "I'm sure we all appreciate your service to the country. It's just that business is different from the military. Here, you have to actually create value and compete in the marketplace." The condescending tone and obvious ignorance of what Sarah had accomplished pushed her over the edge. She had spent a year being polite and professional while enduring these attitudes, but enough was enough. "You're absolutely right that business is about creating value," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger. "So let me share some specific examples of the value I've created since joining this community." She began detailing her achievements with methodical precision. "The Pacific Technologies project I completed last month resulted in $2 million in annual cost savings. The Morrison Industries plant that we helped bring to Millbrook will create 800 jobs and generate over $50 million in annual economic activity. The supply chain optimizations I've implemented for 6 different companies have collectively saved over $8 million in operational costs." The group listened with growing discomfort as Sarah continued. "These aren't theoretical military exercises or government-funded projects. These are real business results that have created jobs, increased profitability, and strengthened our local economy. And they were achieved using skills I developed during my military career." "That's very impressive," Whitman said dismissively, "but any competent consultant could have achieved similar results. It's not like military experience gives you some special advantage in business." Sarah smiled coldly. "You're right that competent consultants should be able to achieve results. So let me ask you, what specific operational improvements have you implemented in your dealerships? What measurable increases in efficiency have you achieved? What innovative solutions have you developed for your clients?" Whitman's face reddened as he realized he was being challenged to defend his own business competence. "My dealerships have been successful for over 20 years, he said defensively. "I don't need to prove anything to someone who's been here for 12 months. "Of course not," Sarah agreed. "But success isn't just about longevity, it's about continued growth, adaptation to changing markets, and providing value to customers. From what I understand, your dealerships have been losing market share to competitors who offer better customer service and more innovative sales approaches." The comment hit home because it was true. Whitman's traditional, high-pressure sales tactics were increasingly ineffective in today's market, and his resistance to change had cost him customers. "How dare you presume to judge my business practices," Whitman sputtered. "You have no idea what it takes to build something from nothing and sustain it over decades." "You're absolutely right," Sarah replied calmly. "I don't have experience building car dealerships. But I do have experience building supply lines in hostile territory, managing multi-million-dollar operations under extreme pressure, and leading teams through life and death situations. If you think that's easier than selling cars in suburban Connecticut, perhaps you should reconsider your perspective." The confrontation was drawing attention from other guests, and Sarah could see Henderson approaching with a concerned expression. She decided to make her final point before the situation escalated further. "I want to be clear about something," she said, addressing the entire group. "I'm proud of my military service, and I wear these medals because they represent achievements that require dedication, sacrifice, and excellence under the most challenging conditions imaginable. If that makes you uncomfortable, that's your problem, not mine." She looked directly at Margaret Foster. As for your comment about my choice to serve rather than get married and start a family, that reveals more about your limited understanding of women's potential than it does about my choices. I chose to serve my country and protect the freedoms that allow all of you to build your businesses and live your comfortable lives. That's not a consolation prize or a stepping stone to something better. That's a calling that demands the highest levels of skill, courage, and commitment. The group stood in uncomfortable silence as Sarah's words sank in. She had effectively dismantled their arguments while maintaining her dignity and professionalism. Henderson reached the group just as Sarah concluded her remarks. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he had heard enough to understand the situation. "Everything's fine," Sarah replied with a slight smile. "We were just having a discussion about the different paths to business success." As the group dispersed, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken, Henderson pulled Sarah aside. "I heard some of that conversation," he said quietly. "I want you to know that your achievements speak for themselves, and anyone who questions your qualifications is simply revealing their own ignorance." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "I appreciate your support. Have you ever considered running for a position on the Business Leaders Association board?" Henderson asked. "I think this community could benefit from your perspective and leadership." The suggestion intrigued Sarah. She had been focused on proving herself through professional success, but perhaps it was time to take a more active role in changing attitudes and creating opportunities for other veterans. "I'll certainly consider it," she said. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Sarah reflected on what had transpired. She had finally confronted the dismissive attitudes and subtle discrimination she had been enduring, and she had done so with dignity and strength. More importantly, she had made it clear that she wouldn't tolerate disrespect for her service or her achievements. The confrontation had been unpleasant, but it had also been necessary. Sarah had spent too much of her life proving herself to people who were determined to underestimate her. Now it was time to focus on building a community that recognized and valued the contributions of all its members, regardless of their backgrounds. As she drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Sarah felt a sense of liberation. She had stopped trying to fit into other people's narrow definitions of success and had started defining success on her own terms. And those terms included using her position and influence to create opportunities for others who had been overlooked or underestimated. The business community was about to discover what happened when you underestimated a decorated veteran who had spent her career exceeding expectations and breaking down barriers. And Sarah Martinez was ready for whatever came next. 6 months after the confrontation at the awards dinner, Sarah had been elected to the Millbrook Business Leaders Association board, where she championed initiatives to support veteran-owned businesses and promote diversity in leadership. Her professional reputation continued to grow, and Henderson and Associates had become one of the most successful consulting firms in the region, largely due to Sarah's innovative approaches and client relationships. But the real test of how far attitudes had shifted came when the association decided to host a special dinner honoring local military veterans. The event was Sarah's idea, proposed as a way to bridge the gap between the military and business communities while recognizing the contributions of veterans to the local economy. The dinner was scheduled for Veterans Day and held at the country club's main ballroom, the same venue where Sarah had been overlooked for the Newcomer Achievement Award the previous year. This time, however, she was one of the organizers and would be giving the keynote address about the value of military experience in business leadership. As guests arrived for the cocktail reception, Sarah noticed a different dynamic than she had experienced at previous business events. Many attendees approached her with genuine respect and interest in her perspectives, and the conversations focused on her professional achievements rather than polite but dismissive acknowledgments of her military service. "Sarah, I wanted to thank you for organizing this event," said Robert Chen, whose company had become one of Henderson and Associates' most important clients. "It's long overdue that we recognize the contributions veterans have made to our business community." "I appreciate your support," Sarah replied. "I think when people understand what military service actually involves, they realize how valuable those skills are in any professional environment. The guest list included not only local business leaders but also several military veterans from the area who had been invited to attend as honored guests. Sarah had personally reached out to veterans working in various industries to ensure their stories would be represented. Among the attendees was Colonel Ret. Michael Rodriguez, who had served as Sarah's commanding officer during one of her deployments to Afghanistan. Rodriguez had retired 5 years earlier and now worked as a defense contractor, but he had made the trip to Millbrook specifically to support Sarah's efforts. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, he said with a warm smile as he approached her during the reception. Sarah had to suppress a laugh at his use of her former rank. Old military habits died hard. Colonel Rodriguez, thank you so much for coming. I know it was a long trip. Wouldn't miss it. I've been following your success here, and I have to say I'm impressed but not surprised. You always had a talent for making the impossible look routine. As they talked, Sarah noticed several business leaders hovering nearby, clearly curious about Rodriguez and his obvious respect for Sarah. She introduced him around, and his stories about Sarah's military leadership began to paint a picture that many civilians had never seen. I remember one operation where Sarah, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, had to coordinate a supply mission involving 12 different military units, 3 allied nations, and about 20 civilian contractors, Rodriguez told a group that included Margaret Foster and Charles Whitman. The operation was critical for establishing a new forward operating base, but every organization involved had different procedures, priorities, and constraints. He described how Sarah had spent weeks developing a complex coordination plan that satisfied everyone's requirements while still achieving the mission objectives. The operation succeeded because of her ability to understand each stakeholder's needs and find creative solutions that created value for everyone involved. It was exactly the kind of sophisticated project management that your most successful businesses require. Margaret Foster listened with a thoughtful expression, clearly reconsidering her previous assumptions about military leadership. That does sound like it required sophisticated business skills, she admitted. Absolutely, Rodriguez continued. Modern military operations are essentially complex business enterprises. We manage multi-million-dollar budgets, coordinate with diverse stakeholders, adapt to rapidly changing conditions, and deliver results under extreme pressure. The skills are completely transferable to civilian business. As the evening progressed, Sarah had numerous conversations with attendees who seemed genuinely interested in learning about military experience and how it related to business success. The dismissive attitudes and subtle condescension that had characterized her early months in Millbrook were largely absent. The dinner itself featured presentations from several local veterans who had achieved success in various fields: a nurse who had served as a combat medic, an engineer who had managed construction projects in Iraq, a teacher who had served in military intelligence. Each speaker described how their military experience had prepared them for civilian success in ways that traditional career paths could not match. When Sarah rose to give the keynote address, she felt a sense of anticipation rather than the defensive tension she had experienced at previous events. The audience was genuinely interested in what she had to say rather than waiting for an opportunity to diminish her achievements. 2 years ago, when I first returned to Millbrook after retiring from the Army, I encountered a lot of misconceptions about what military service involves and how it prepares people for civilian careers, she began. Some people viewed military service as something you did when you couldn't succeed in the real world, or as a temporary adventure before settling down to serious adult responsibilities. She paused to let the words sink in, noting that several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Margaret Foster and Charles Whitman were among those who seemed to recognize themselves in her description. Tonight, I want to share a different perspective on military service and its value to our business community, Sarah continued. Military service isn't a consolation prize or a stepping stone to something better. It's a demanding profession that develops exactly the kinds of skills our most successful businesses need. She outlined the key competencies that military service developed: leadership under pressure, complex problem solving, multicultural communication, resource optimization, crisis management, and ethical decision making. For each competency, she provided specific examples of how these skills translated directly to business success. When we talk about leadership, we're not talking about giving orders and expecting blind obedience, she explained. Military leadership requires earning respect through competence and character, motivating people facing difficult and dangerous situations, building cohesive teams from diverse backgrounds, and developing subordinates even when that means losing your best people to promotions. She described specific leadership challenges she had faced and how the solutions required exactly the same skills that successful business leaders use to motivate employees, manage change, and build organizational culture. The audience listened intently as Sarah moved on to discuss operational management and strategic planning. She described military operations that involved coordinating multiple organizations, managing complex supply chains, optimizing resource allocation, and adapting to rapidly changing conditions, all under life and death pressure. These weren't theoretical exercises or government-funded projects with unlimited budgets, she emphasized. Military operations require the same cost consciousness, efficiency focus, and results orientation that drives successful businesses. The main difference is that the consequences of failure are more immediate and severe. As Sarah continued her presentation, she noticed that the audience was fully engaged. People were taking notes, asking thoughtful questions, and genuinely trying to understand the connections between military experience and business success. The veterans in this room represent an untapped resource for our business community, she concluded. They bring proven leadership skills, operational expertise, and a commitment to excellence that can transform any organization. The question isn't whether military experience translates to business success, it's whether our business community is wise enough to recognize and embrace that potential. The applause that followed was genuine and sustained, reflecting a real shift in understanding rather than polite acknowledgement. As Sarah returned to her seat, she felt that she had finally succeeded in changing the conversation about military service and its value. During the networking period after her presentation, the tone of conversations was markedly different from previous events. People approached her with specific questions about how to identify and recruit veteran talent, how to translate military experience in hiring decisions, and how to better support veteran-owned businesses. "Sarah, your presentation really opened my eyes," said Tom Bradley, who had been one of her most vocal critics early on. "I had no idea that military operations involved that level of complexity and business sophistication. I'm wondering if you might be interested in helping me recruit some veteran talent for my construction company." The conversation represented a complete reversal from his previous dismissive attitudes toward military experience. Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction not just at the personal validation, but at the broader shift in understanding that seemed to be occurring. Margaret Foster also approached her with what appeared to be a genuine apology. "Sarah, I owe you an apology for some of the things I said when you first returned to Millbrook. I didn't understand what military service actually involved or appreciate the skills it developed. Your success in the business world makes perfect sense now that I understand your background better." As the evening wound down, Colonel Rodriguez pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "I wanted you to know how proud I am of what you've accomplished here," he said. "Changing civilian attitudes toward military service is one of the most challenging missions any veteran can undertake, and you've achieved something really significant." "Thank you, sir. It's been a long process, but I think we're finally making progress." "You've done more than make progress, you've created a model that other communities could follow. Have you considered writing about your experience or speaking at other events? There are a lot of veterans facing similar challenges, and businesses missing out on incredible talent because of the same misconceptions you've addressed here." The suggestion intrigued Sarah. She had been focused on proving herself in her local community, but perhaps her experience could have broader impact. As the last guests departed and Sarah helped clean up from the event, she reflected on how dramatically things had changed since her high school reunion 2.5 years earlier. The dismissive attitudes and subtle discrimination hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had been replaced by genuine respect and recognition of her achievements. More importantly, the event had succeeded in its broader goal of connecting the military and business communities. Several business leaders had expressed interest in partnering with veteran-owned businesses, and multiple veterans had made connections that could lead to new opportunities. 2 weeks after the Veterans Day dinner, Sarah received a phone call that would mark another significant milestone in her journey. The caller identified himself as Lieutenant General Patricia Hayes, currently serving as the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff for Logistics. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. I've been hearing about the work you're doing in your community to bridge the gap between military and civilian business leaders. Sarah was surprised to receive a call from such a senior officer but honored by the recognition. Thank you, General. It's been an important project for me personally and professionally. I wanted to let you know that your efforts haven't gone unnoticed at the highest levels of Army leadership. We're always looking for innovative approaches to help our transitioning soldiers succeed in civilian careers, and your model seems to have achieved remarkable results. General Hayes went on to explain that the Army was developing a new program to help retiring officers transition to civilian business careers, and they wanted Sarah to help design and implement the initiative. We'd like you to consider returning to active duty for a special assignment to lead this program, Hayes continued. It would involve working with major corporations, consulting firms, and business schools to create pathways for military officers to translate their experience into civilian business success. The offer was flattering and would represent a significant recognition of Sarah's achievements, but she had found her calling in the civilian world and wasn't ready to return to full-time military service. I'm honored by the offer, General, but I've committed to my current position and community. However, I'd be very interested in supporting the program as a civilian consultant or advisor. I understand completely, and that arrangement could work very well. We need someone with credibility in both worlds, and your success in civilian business gives you exactly that. As Sarah hung up the phone, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The recognition from senior military leadership validated not only her personal achievements but the broader principle she had been advocating, that military service developed skills that were not just valuable but essential for success in today's complex business environment. 3 months later, Sarah stood before another audience, this time at a national conference on veteran employment hosted by the Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington, D.C. Her presentation, titled Breaking Down Barriers: How One Community Learned to Value Military Experience, drew standing ovations and resulted in invitations to speak at similar events across the country. But the moment she remembered most clearly came after her presentation, when a young female Army captain approached her with tears in her eyes. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for what you said about women in the military," the captain said. "I'm getting ready to retire next year, and I've been worried about whether civilian employers would take me seriously. Your story gives me hope that I can succeed and maybe help other veterans along the way." Sarah smiled and handed the captain her business card. "Don't just hope, expect to succeed. And, when you do, remember to reach back and help the next person coming behind you." As Sarah flew back to Millbrook that evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a dismissed reunion attendee to a nationally recognized advocate for veteran employment. The medals on her lapel weren't just decorations or symbols of past achievements, they represented a standard of excellence and commitment that continued to drive her success in whatever environment she chose to serve. The small town that had once questioned the value of her military service now proudly claimed her as one of their most distinguished business leaders. More importantly, attitudes toward military service and veteran employment had shifted not just in Millbrook but in communities across the country where Sarah's story had been shared. Looking ahead, Sarah saw endless possibilities for continuing to break down barriers and create opportunities for veterans while demonstrating the value of military experience in civilian careers. Her mission had evolved from proving her own worth to changing systems and attitudes that affected thousands of veterans making similar transitions. And, just like every mission she had undertaken in her military career, Sarah Martinez was committed to achieving success while exceeding everyone's expectations. The only difference now was that success was measured not just in personal achievement but in the opportunities created for others and the barriers removed for those who would follow in her path.